I am absolutely thrilled to have a chance to meet with you. And you're wearing a button right now.
Mm-hmm.
What did the buttons mean to the movement? I saw there's a whole display of buttons out there, and they're from a professor who was near Greensboro,
mm-hmm.
and kind of inspired by the sit-in. At your time, was that meaningful?
Oh yes, and in that display there are at least 3 or 4 different buttons from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and there are many from the NAACP, and I was just gratified to see these various NAACP buttons which have dates. So they're like 1954, 1956, 1957, and each one a different color. I had never seen the multicolored ones. I'd always seen the red ones. Maybe, I think it was 1954. Maybe 54 was a big year. It was a big year, as a matter of fact, but maybe it was a big button production year. But I've never seen those buttons, and was glad to see them. And the other stuff in that display are just wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Talk about 1954, that was the year of Brown versus Board.
Right.
And you've mentioned the fact that you were a product of separate but equal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also the founder of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and he was on the court of that Brown versus Board of Education. Can you speak to that and what Brown versus Board did to launch sort of the movement?
What Brown v. Board did was not integrating schools, because it didn't do that. But what it did do is it gave sanction from the nation's highest court to justice. Even though justice didn't roll down like mighty waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, it sort of opened the door. It gave a moral stamp to the justice of the civil rights movement. And that, I think, it encouraged so many people, black and white, to become involved in this in one way or the other. So that's what it really did.
By the way, I'm thrilled to have a chance to interview you, but I know you interview so many people as part of your work product. Would you rather be interviewed or be the interviewer?
Well, I think I'd rather, I'm not sure, because in the work product you're talking about, I ask everybody the same question. Everybody. So it means I interviewed Justice Clarence Thomas, and I interviewed somebody as different from Justice Clarence Thomas as you can imagine. And I asked each one of them the same question, because we were trying to get at a single thing about what it was, engage them, how they got involved in what they did. And I felt constrained by that. I wanted to ask him other questions. I wanted to ask Justice Thomas different things than I asked him. But so I'd rather interview other people and be able to ask them whatever I wanted to ask them, rather than the way I did it. I used to be on a TV show called America's Black Forum, and I used to interview people there, and I got to interview them and ask them whatever I wanted, and I really enjoyed that.
When you come on campus like this, they see a Julian Bond, very much representative of the movement, representative of a time, and I, for one, also remember so strongly watching PBS Eyes on the Prize, of which you were the narrator. And I'm going to do something as just a kind of a fun exercise, because you have seen so many folks who were part of the movement. I actually have some baseball cards of members, and I'd appreciate if you just sort of look at them, and if there's a vignette, a story, anecdote, whatever you'd like, I'd love to have you do that.
This is Thurgood Marshall. I just read a book, I can't remember the title, about Thurgood Marshall's young years, about the years when he's finished law school, he's practicing law in Baltimore, he's not associated with the NAACP. So it's that period before he goes to the NAACP, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book, because the author writes about Baltimore and what Baltimore meant to Thurgood Marshall. And Baltimore made Thurgood Marshall, created him. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. This is Marion Wright Edelman, who was a schoolmate of mine. That's to say, she went to Spelman College across the street, Morehouse College, where I went to school, and she and I were arrested together at the Atlanta City Hall. And it's great to see her. I have a great affection for her. This is Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy. This is the march from Selma to Montgomery. Abernathy is reading the newspaper, and King is looking over the side saying, why is he reading the newspaper when we should be paying attention to something serious? This is Roy Wilkins, who is an underappreciated man in the civil rights movement, thought to be more conservative than he actually was, thought to be more of a go-slow person than he actually was. But he's a noble figure and should get better attention than he does. This is James Farmer, who's in the same position, should get more attention than he did. And he knows he has a button in his lapel. I can't quite make out what kind of button. Oh, it looks like an Urban League button. You know, that three things. This is Eiffel Randolph, the founder of the March on Washington, the great labor leader, wonderful, wonderful guy. Peculiar guy from Florida with an accent, sounds like he grew up in posh London, but a wonderful, wonderful man. And here's another single picture of Abernathy. Here's Whitney Young. Whitney Young was my neighbor. He and his family lived next door to my family when we lived in Atlanta in faculty housing. I had 2 daughters. I just saw one of his daughters in New York City. He was a great guy. There's a nice book about him. I know who this guy is, but I can't think of his name.
Maybe on the back.
It's E.D. Nixon. This is a younger E.D. Nixon than any picture I've ever seen. This is the man who got Mrs. Parks out of jail. That's what he's best known for. He's the great organizer, a labor union activist in Montgomery, a wonderful, wonderful guy. This is John Lewis, whom I know as the boy from Troy, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, great, great friend of mine of many years standing. We have many, many great times together. He's about to be honored by a group in Washington. I have to make up some things to say about him for a video, which I've not done yet.
By the way, I think you mentioned something at the March on Washington, that Martin Luther King's speech was probably the most beautiful speech, but that John Lewis's was the strongest.
It was the strongest speech. It was the most militant speech. And John is the only person speaking that day who said black people instead of Negroes or colored people. And my job, I had 2 jobs at the March on Washington. One of my jobs was to pass out copies of John's speech. And I tried to point out to the newspapers, look what he's saying here. Because I thought that would make us more militant than we really were, or at least more militant than we appeared to be. They didn't pay any attention, didn't make any difference. My other job was giving Coca-Colas to the movie stars. And I remember giving a Coke to Sammy Davis Jr., and he said, "Thanks, kid." This is James Meredith, Marshall McShane, and John Katzenbach at Ole Miss, I think they're delivering Meredith to the registrar's front door, and they're about to be turned away. I think that is at Ole Miss, not at. And this is Dorothy Counts. I was crazy about Dorothy Counts. Dorothy, who integrated the schools, I think, in Charlotte. And I don't think this says this is yes, Dorothy Counts. I was crazy about Dorothy Counts. I never met her. She's a real cutie. And this, of course, is Rosa Parks. You don't have to say much about her. A great book about Rosa Parks, written by my TA from Harvard, Jean Theo Harris. The newest book about Rosa Parks. Everybody should buy this book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book about the radical Rosa Parks. It gives you a side of Rosa Parks you know nothing about. This is the March on Washington crowd. This is Septima Clark, whom I only met on 1 or 2 occasions, but a wonderful unsung heroine of the civil rights movement. This, of course, Dr. King in the pulpit. This is Daisy Bates.
By the way, how did you meet Dr. King? What was your first moment in time when you actually were part of his work?
I met Dr. King when he taught me. You know, a lot of people say I was a student of Dr. King's. Dr. King only taught one time, only taught one class, only 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. So if somebody else says they were a student of Dr. King and they're not one of those 8, they're telling a lie. They're big liars. He taught a class at Morehouse College. He co-taught a class at Morehouse College with the man who had taught him philosophy at Morehouse College, Dr. Samuel Williams, who was president of the NAACP in Atlanta. And I was one of his students. And one day he and I were walking across the campus, and I said to him, Doc, his friends called him Doc. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "Julian, I'm not doing well." He said, "Unemployment is high, racism is everywhere, segregation is immovable." He said, "I feel terrible, I have a nightmare." I said, "Doc, why don't you turn that around? I have a dream." And well,
there you go.
You heard it from me.
That's right.
I made that up.
But you know the good thing about oral history, will you say it one more time, it'll be.
You know, I have a friend who was doing a study on the Scottsboro Boys, and he interviewed who wrote that big book on the Scottsboro Boys? Somebody here knows that. from used to be at Emory, and now is at then was at University of South Carolina. Big book on the Scottsboro Boys, and he had interviewed the doctor who had treated the women, and the doctor said, "You know something?" He said, "Those women were not raped. I examined them, and they were not raped." So my friend writes this down in his PhD thesis, and his teacher says, "You can't use that. It's oral history. It doesn't mean anything." So he wrote it down in his notes, put his notes in his file, quoted his notes, and they said, "Okay, it's okay, you can use it that way." Why can't I remember this guy's name?
Turn it back.
Well, I remember Daisy Bates' name, but the guy who, the history teacher.
We'll get our people on it here.
Yes, so these historians should know this name. This is Fannie Lou Hamer, just a wonderful heroine. We know a lot about her. This is Fred Shuttlesworth, a wonderful, wonderful fighter for freedom. This is, I know her name, Ruby Hurley, NAACP stalwart. Didn't always do the very right thing because she was more interested in the NAACP than in the movement, but a wonderful woman nonetheless. These are the three young men sitting in. I think these are the three young men from Greensboro, but I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure they are. Yeah. Isn't it? Yes. This is Medgar Evers, the NAACP field secretary, the first NAACP field secretary who was shot and killed in Mississippi. And I said earlier that I was at this meeting last night celebrating Clyde Kennard, and he is one of the people who fought hardest to free Clyde Kennard. This is a great picture from Birmingham of the protesters dancing in the wake of the hoses.
Did that get the movement, your group, SNCC, this time period, did that get really melded together when you were watching that on TV?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. It was. I think it did for the whole country. You know, President Kennedy saw this. He said, "This makes me sick." It just shows you the power of TV and how helpful, at least in this early stage of the movement, television was, how much television did to push the movement forward. This is Bayard Rustin, who is a great organizer of the March on Washington, a wonderful, wonderful guy. He's becoming more and more well-known than he is before. A book of his letters has just been printed and published, and it's great because he's a man of so many interests. Here. He's into this, he's into this, he's into this, he's into this. He's just a wonderful, wonderful guy. This is a student at the University of Oklahoma. What's his name? What's this guy's name?
Sweet. There's a guy with regards to.
Yes, he's sitting in the hallway.
Right. Separate but equal law
yes.
school, yeah.
He integrated the University of Oklahoma, but they made him sit in the hallway. And he's sitting in the hallway looking at the white students, and these people are just crazy. This is Charles Hamilton Houston, I believe. Yes, it is. The NAACP legal wizard, just a wonderful, wonderful guy. Died too soon, lost too early. This is Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett Till's mother, a great fighter on his behalf so that he would not be forgotten, that his sacrifice would have not been in vain. Just great. This is Diane Nash and three students from Nashville sitting in at lunch counters in Nashville. And this is a very young, Jesus, what's her name? I don't want to turn it over and look, because I know her name. Yes, Ella Baker, I was right. Ella Baker, who is just everything to the movement. She was SNCC's mentor, the mentor to all the people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Just a wonderful, wonderful people. Helped Dr. King create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, helped him establish it, helped him get it going, and was wonderful with SNCC, helped us know which way to go.
By the way, we just recently interviewed Dorothy Cotton. Does that name mean
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah.
She ended up leading everybody in a choral choir.
Oh, she's good at that, and a great singer, This is the Freedom Riders outside Anniston after their bus has been attacked and burned. This is Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Huey Newton came to Atlanta once when he was head of the Panthers, and my brother and I were tasked with taking him around and showing him where to go. And I wanted so badly to impress him that I got a gun. Looked like a German Luger, but was just a .22. And my brother's driving the car, and I'm sitting over here, and Bobby Seale and his brother are sitting in the back, and the gun is on the seat between us. And I wanted, Bobby to see the gun so he'd know how, and Huey to see the gun, they'd know what great fighters we were. Well, they didn't notice them, and so I began to pick the gun up and say, look over there, and look at this, look at this. He still didn't pay attention. This is Dr. Du Bois, who is the towering intellectual figure of the 20th century movement, just an incredible personality, wonderful, wonderful man. As I say, I've got a picture of myself with him, and it's just a treasure to have. This is a black guy who's applying to go to the University of Maryland. That's Thurgood Marshall standing over there. I don't know who this is on this side. That's, what's this guy's name? But we know it. And this is the wonderful SNCC Freedom Singers. Actually, it's the Freedom Singers, two of the Freedom Singers, Bernice Johnson and Cordell Reagan. They eventually marry, so she becomes Bernice Reagan. And then on the left-hand side, it's Bob Zellner, and the woman here is Dorothy Miller, who marries Bob Zellner and becomes Dorothy Zellner. And this is not Adolph Rollins, but Avon Rollins from Knoxville, Tennessee. And they're singing. And Cordell had this beautiful, beautiful voice. I always wanted Cordell to sing at my funeral, and the sad story is I had to sing at his. But he was just a wonderful, wonderful singer. This is Stokely Carmichael, or as he called himself, Stokely Starmichael, because of he had a friends called FASC, Friends and some of Stokely Carmichael, who used to send him care packages from the North. Wonderful, wonderful guy. This is an NAACP protest, I believe. I don't know when or where, probably New York. This is Bob Moses, the leader of the Mississippi Movement for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, just a wonderful, wonderful guy. He used to talk, when he talked like this, and pretty soon you'd notice everybody in SNCC was doing this. Every single person was doing this. This is a great photographer, Danny Lyon, who took many, many pictures for SNCC. He's got one real great book of SNCC pictures. It's the best pictures of us anybody has ever taken. Here is a poster celebrating Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, and asking people to remember them and to carry the fight on. This is the woman in Montgomery who was head of the Women's Association after someone else had begun it. What is her name? Joanne Gibson Robinson. Went to Fort Valley State College where my father was president. Got her first degree there. And a wonderful fighter in the movement. This is the woman who was shot at the settlement of Montgomery after that march, or before that march rather, Viola Luizzo. And I guess that's her husband, who was a UAW activist. This is Central High School. You know, there's a black high school in Little Rock that was built for black high school students on this same model. It is the same school, the same building, much smaller, but the exact same building. This, I think, is Howard University students protesting something Black Power related at the Howard campus. And this is me. This is a terrible picture of me. But I think this is, I'm not really sure where it is. Looks like we're in some waiting room or something. I don't know. That's it.
So if they put on that back of that baseball card, Julian Bond, what are some of the highlights they're going to put on there? Because the baseball cards, it's normally 2 or 3 highlights. What would you do to rewrite that?
You know, Chuck Morgan, the civil rights lawyer, he and a group of his friends got some chance to play with, I think, the Tigers. And, you know, all of these men in their 40s and 50s, out of shape, can't do anything. And he had on the back of his card, was it, talks big, bats wrong. Mine, I don't know. I'd like it to say, let me see. I had something I wanted to put on my headstone, and I can't think of it. Oh no, easily amused. That's what I want, easily amused. I want race man and easily amused. That's what I want on my headstone.
Last night I watched the CNN special dealing with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then immediately the Lyndon Baines Johnson being sworn in, and immediately kind of segueing into the Civil Rights Act. Would the Civil Rights Act, of which Allegheny is celebrating this year, would that have been precipitated at that pace if Kennedy had not been assassinated?
If Kennedy had not been assassinated, I don't know if the Civil Rights Act would have passed the next year, would have become the '64 Civil Rights Act as it did in the aftermath of Kennedy's death. I think only Johnson had the moxie, had the ability to put it through Congress. And Johnson was the kind of person who could effectively use Kennedy's death to push it through the Congress, which he did effectively and made it into law. And if there had been no Lyndon Johnson, I don't think there would have been a '64 Civil Rights Bill. At least not in '64, maybe '65, who knows, but not in '64.
1966, Dr. King and you end up being co-petitioners in a Supreme Court matter. How did that happen, and what was that about?
This is Bond v. Floyd. I had gotten elected to the legislature, and my colleagues, I got elected to a one-year term because the federal courts had created new districts in Georgia, and I was running in one of these new districts. And we were to have 1 year, the people who won these seats were to have one-year terms and then could run for a two-year term in the legislature. So I was elected to a one-year term, and in the interim, a colleague of mine named Sammy Young from Tuskegee, Alabama, had been shot and killed for trying to use the bathroom in a white-only gas station, shot in the back and killed. Now, he had lost one of his kidneys in the Navy. And the irony of this guy, having lost his kidney in service to his country and not being able to go to the bathroom, was just too much. And so a lot of anti-war sentiment that's bubbling up in the movement came to the surface, and we issued a anti-war statement which would sound like nothing today, but sounded radical then. And my colleagues to be in the legislature opposed the idea of my being seated and issued a petition against me and threw me out. They declared my seat vacant. I ran for the vacancy. I won the vacancy. They threw me out again. But this time I'm going to the Supreme Court, and I finally get to the court, and I'm sitting in the court next to my lawyer's law partner, Victor Rabinowitz, and his partner, Leonard Boudin, is talking to the Attorney General of Georgia is arguing that Georgia had a right to throw me out. And Justice, the one they called Byron White, said to him, he said, "Is this all you have?" He said, "You come all the way up here and this is all you have?" And I said to Rabinowitz, I said, "We're winning, aren't we?" He said, "Yes, you are." And we did, 9-0. So that's how I got out.
So your name is there permanently?
Forever. Yes, that's right.
Dr. King actually got on the pulpit and spoke in favor of this. And why was he willing to join as the petitioner in that case? I'm just trying to...
He was a constituent of mine,
okay,
and so he had standing in that sense. He was being denied his representation in the legislature because of this, and he was opposed to the war. He was right at the point of edging himself into more and more strong statements against the war, and this was an ideal situation for him. He was committed to it, and it was the right thing for him to do.
Last night in preparing for this, went to YouTube, hit a button, and there in 1968 there's a grainy black and white presentation at the convention, and there's your name by the delegates of Wisconsin put into nomination as a Vice President of the United States. Did you know that was coming? Was that in the background being played out?
I don't think so. I don't think I knew it was coming. But the guy who did that was Theodore, well, I can't think of his name now, I'm sorry to say, but he nominated me for, no, somebody else nominated me for Vice President from Wisconsin. And, you know, I was much appreciated, but I wasn't eligible. I was too young. You have to be older than I was then.
You know, the scene is Dan Rather, who was covering the convention, was just kind of in your face right then and there when all this was happening, asking you lots of questions as to whether New York, this had been sort of set up and planned in advance.
Yes, you know, they always think there's some conspiracy here, don't they? I don't remember any of that. I don't remember Dan Rather.
I'll send you the link.
Thank you. I'd like to see it. My children would like to see it.
What's the legacy of Julian Bond?
I'm not ready to have a legacy yet.
That's a good legacy.
Yeah.
Not ready.
Let's hope.
SNCC is what SNCC was inspired pretty much by that which occurred in Greensboro. How did that kind of information get down to you as sort of that seminal event which would create in 1960 when you got together in Raleigh, North Carolina to sort of create this?
Newspapers and TV. You read in the newspapers of these sit-in demonstrations, first in Greensboro, then a little further south, then a little further south, then a little further south, and you said to yourself, or somebody said to me, don't you think this ought to happen in Atlanta too? And I said, it's going to happen in Atlanta. And he said, why don't we make it happen here? And before I could say, what do you mean we? He said, you talk to these people, I'll talk to those people, and we'll make it happen here. And so that's how I got involved in the movement. Somebody said to me, why don't we do this thing? And I said, okay, we'll do it.
So when you get together in this group in Raleigh, I mean, how did it actually get organized? How did SNCC, bunch of interested folks, I assume principally African-American?
Yes, almost all of us African-American, all of us from various black colleges that had been engaged in sit-ins or were about to get engaged in sit-ins. And we just wanted to be a part of this thing. And we had the good sense to know that we had to organize ourselves in some way. And we had good advice from Ella Baker, who helped us, not by saying do this or do that or do it this way or do it that way, but by saying, what do you think would happen if you did this? Do you think it might be a good idea to do that? Does this sound reasonable? What about this? She's the kind of person who didn't say do it, but who said, what do you think you ought to do next? And don't you think you ought to do it in this way? She was just wonderful, and she guided us along, and we created this organization that was one of the best organizations of its time, and there'll never be another like it.
As literally, you used the term earlier, which one I not use on film as far as a star, something, and but I feel the same way being in front of you as you being there and the beginning of the movement. I'm incredibly going through the history of the civil rights movement just by flashing through those cards there. I can't tell you how thrilled I am, but do you feel an extra kind of onus that's emblematic of that time period so that no one ever forgets that which occurred during the 50s and 60s to sort of get to maybe some of the freedoms that students take for granted today?
I think there are some people who've never remembered them. There's some people who will never remember them today. There's some people who have no idea of what happened then. We Americans aren't good with history. We don't treasure it as much as we ought to. We don't look at it as often as we should. We're not conscious of what happened yesterday or the day before that. So I'm not so confident that people are going to be remembering this years from now. I think some people will always think of these years and these days and these times, but I think some people never will know, never will have any idea of what's happening. It's amazing to me, you know, my students, when I ask them what do they know about the civil rights movement before the class begins, they say there was segregation, it was awful, Martin Luther King came along, he marched, he protested, he was killed, and segregation went away. And that's what they know. And of course, that is the story, but it's not the whole story. It's not the real story. It's not the story of all the people who made the movement. And the job we have, who teach history, is to tell people there were lots of people in it, and some of them were just like you.
And part of that is a process which whatever the cause happens to be is a process they can learn from what you folks, did. Do you find that a challenge in today's?
I find it a challenge, and I find it flattering. I met with this group of kids, the Dreamers in Florida, who had occupied the state capitol in Tallahassee over the Stand Your Ground laws, and was lucky enough to be with them on the day they called it off, on the day they said, we've come far enough, we're going to do something else now. And they told me that SNCC was their inspiration. And I thought, wow, that's the nicest thing somebody could say about that, about me.
Well, you're our inspiration, and thank you to coming to Allegheny College.
My pleasure. This is my 4th trip here.
Terrific. Welcome back, and may there be more.
Thank you.
Thank you.